Part 1. Medieval Crime and Punishment for Women. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a topic that's, let's just say it's a bit of a mixed bag of grim, strange, and sometimes downright funny history. Yeah, we're talking about medieval crime and punishment for women. Now, I know, crime and punishment doesn't exactly scream sleepy bedtime stories, but trust me, it's gonna be an interesting ride. So get comfy, dim the lights, and settle in, because this is going to be a chill, weird history journey where we look at some of the more unusual and downright absurd things that could land a medieval woman in serious trouble. Spoiler, the bar was not high. Now, let's get one thing out of the way. Medieval society? Not exactly known for its sympathy toward women. Not even close. The whole medieval justice system? Yeah, let's say it had some issues. Imagine a system where your life could be totally derailed by something as simple as gossip, and where the punishments, well, let's just say they ranged from inconveniently unpleasant to please let me just disappear forever levels of awful. And who were the ones handing out these delightful punishments? Well, it was mostly the men in charge. Kings, bishops, lords, and occasionally a judge with a love for theaters and a particular hatred of women. So, grab your favorite beverage, dim those lights, and let's meander through the weird, dark, and occasionally ridiculous world of medieval crime and punishment. I promise it won't be a fun time, but it'll definitely be a fascinating one. The basics of medieval crime. Before we get to the whole what happened to women part, let's take a quick look at the medieval justice system in general. Now, crime wasn't exactly what it is today. For starters, the concept of due process was, let's say, a little less refined. It was more like, did you offend someone powerful enough to care? Great, let's move on to punishment. The whole lawyer thing was pretty much reserved for those who could afford it, which, spoiler alert, wasn't really any women. Laws were often vague, punishments were arbitrary, and everyone was just kind of figuring things out as they went. And that's not even getting into the real fun, how you proved your innocence. If you were accused of something, you might be subject to trial by ordeal, which included fun activities like walking on hot coals or being thrown into a river to see if you floated, because, of course, witches float. Yeah, sure. Just a little medieval logic for you. But now, let's focus on the ladies. Why? Well, because their crimes were often a little more, shall we say, gender-specific. Women in medieval times could get into serious trouble for, well, anything that made them appear too independent, too forward, or too, well, like they might not take kindly to being told what to do by a bunch of men. Shocking, I know. The crime of being too independent, the witch hunts. Let's start with one of the biggest and most tragic forms of punishment women faced, accusations of witchcraft. A lot of times, being accused of being a witch wasn't about anything as sinister as, actually practicing witchcraft. No. It was much more likely to be something like, you were talking to your neighbor too much, or your cat doesn't like my dog. Seriously, the witch trials weren't a whole lot more than medieval versions of middle school gossip, just with way higher stakes. And in a time when the church was, well, really into making sure everyone's soul was properly under control, anyone who stood out in any way was a suspect. If you were single, or if you were widowed and then dared to own property, or if you had a bit of knowledge of herbs because, women were the ones who actually knew this stuff, that could make you a target. Imagine being a woman who knew how to cure a cold with a bit of sage tea. Next thing you know, you're being tried for sorcery. What a vibe, huh? Now, we've all heard of the Salem witch trials, but witch hunts were widespread all over medieval Europe. Women were often accused of having the devil's mark or being in league with Satan, often for reasons that had, nothing to do with actual witchcraft. Take the infamous case of Joan of Arc. No, she wasn't burned at the stake for being a witch, but the charge of heresy was basically the medieval equivalent. Why? She dared to wear men's clothing and, more importantly, led an army. Big mistake, Joan. But beyond the larger historical figures, regular women who fell under suspicion could be forced to undergo torture or trial by ordeal to prove their innocence. There were no, well, she could have just been misunderstood moments here. If you survived, great, you were innocent. Probably. If not, well, then maybe the fire had the final say on your fate. Charming system, isn't it? Women and theft, the crime of desperation. Of course, not all crimes were about being accused of devilish dealings. Some women just had to do what they had to do to survive in a harsh world. And let's be real, living in medieval times wasn't exactly a walk in the park. A lot of women found themselves accused of theft, but not because they were gold hoarders or master thieves. It was often because they were stealing bread or, in some cases, stealing back their own property. This was a time when property laws were not, let's say, fair to women. So if a man owned something that had once belonged to a woman, well, it was likely considered his, whether she liked it or not. And as far as punishments for theft, oh, they were charming. If you were lucky, you got a fine, assuming you had the money. If not, you might get your hand chopped off. Oh, and sometimes, in particularly unfortunate cases, women could end up in stocks for public humiliation. Imagine being pelted with rotten fruit, all because you tried to feed your family. Sounds pretty fair, right? But to be honest, the real fun came when the punishment for theft involved some actual creativity. For instance, there were instances where women would be punished by being forced to wear a scold's bridle, a lovely metal device designed to keep women's mouths shut, because apparently talking too much was its own crime. Yeah, let that sink in for a moment. If you are a woman with a loud opinion, you might find yourself wearing a literal muzzle in public. How charming! The crime of being a bad wife. Ah, yes, in medieval times, if a woman wasn't up to snuff in the wife department, well, she could be punished for it. And naturally, the husband had the final say on what constituted bad wife behavior. If she didn't cook his meals on time, if she didn't bear him enough children, or if, gasp, didn't meet his needs in the bedroom because, of course, everything was her responsibility, the punishment could range from being publicly scolded to actual imprisonment. Sometimes it was more subtle. For instance, in medieval England, there was something called wife-beating, which, while not exactly a punishment per se, was often overlooked or even endorsed by the courts. In fact, if a man was accused of hitting his wife, he could sometimes avoid punishment entirely by claiming it was a justifiable act for her behavior. Isn't that just the picture of medieval justice? It wasn't uncommon for women to be blamed for the failures of their husbands. And of course, if she was wealthy, well, there was always the possibility that the family would just dispose of her through divorce or imprisonment if she wasn't living up to the expectations of her noble husband. So much for love, huh? Let's float over to another royal disaster. So far, we've looked at some of the ways that medieval women could end up in some pretty bad situations. But we're far from done. Trust me, this is a time period where everything could go wrong. There were always new and inventive ways to make life as miserable as possible for women. Let's move on and explore a few more ways these lovely ladies found themselves in even stickier situations.
All right, let's keep things rolling as we continue our journey through the labyrinthine mess that was medieval crime and punishment for women. If you're still with me, good, because we've got more to unpack. Trust me, it's going to be a slow, steady stream of weirdness. So grab your blanket, maybe turn down the lights a little more, and let's talk about a few more ways women found themselves in deep trouble. It wasn't always witchcraft, you know. Sometimes it was something as seemingly innocent as a dowry. The crime of dowries, or why women were basically property. So let's start with the concept of dowries. If you don't know, a dowry was essentially a sum of money, land, or goods that a woman's family was required to give to her future husband upon marriage. Why? Well, because women were seen as property in a lot of ways, and the dowry was meant to compensate the husband for the burden of having to care for his wife. Because, you know, having a wife was basically a financial responsibility in medieval times. Romantic, right? Now, there were all kinds of ways women could get into trouble if a dowry was involved. First of all, let's acknowledge how unbelievably stressful it must have been to grow up with the looming pressure of a dowry. For many families, this meant that daughters were just treated like dealings for the family's wealth, rather than actual human beings. And oh, the pressure didn't stop once the wedding was over. If the husband found the dowry to be insufficient, or if he suspected that the woman had been hiding any assets, well, she could find herself at the mercy of the law. Depending on where you were, a wife could actually be punished for concealing part of her dowry. Sometimes this even meant she was thrown in jail. Now, really, this was a thing. Imagine spending your whole life getting ready to be given away like an object, and then, years later, getting punished because your family didn't cough up enough cash to make your husband happy. Super fun, right? The crime of divorce. Spoiler, women didn't have much of a say. Next up, let's talk about divorce. Because for women, the concept of divorce was a bit, well, complicated. To be honest, medieval divorce was like trying to untangle a string of Christmas lights that had been stuffed in a drawer for 3 years. It was messy, confusing, and really not something anyone wanted to deal with. But when things went south in a marriage, and women found themselves trapped in relationships that were not ideal, to put it nicely, well, divorce was sometimes the only way out. However, women didn't have much of a say in the process. First off, medieval divorce was hardly ever granted to women. If you wanted out of a bad marriage, you pretty much needed to either have a whole lot of money, a lot of power, or some serious political connections. If you didn't, well, good luck with that. Men, however, had a bit more freedom in the matter. Some kings and lords would just declare a marriage invalid if they felt like it. But for women, they were generally expected to stick it out, whether or not the marriage was abusive or emotionally damaging. It was just another delightful feature of medieval marriage. The wife was stuck, and the husband held all the power. For those who couldn't escape their husbands, the crime of not being a good wife, remember the whole "you don't make me happy anymore" thing, could be used as an excuse for abandonment. You're being lazy, you're being a burden, or even worse, the dreaded "you're barren" accusation. If a woman couldn't provide heirs, because obviously it's all on her, then the marriage could be dissolved, sometimes with her being accused of the crime of being, well, incapable. The punishment? A life of ruin. No dowry, no inheritance, no second chances. Inheritance. Who's in charge here? Speaking of inheritance, this is where things get tricky. When it came to passing down property or wealth, women were often not in the driver's seat. In fact, medieval inheritance laws were about as unfair as they come. You see, if a man died, his estate was usually divided among his male heirs. If there were no sons, his property often went to male relatives. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was the law. Women, even if they were the closest relatives, would often find themselves completely shut out from inheritance. But here's the twist. Sometimes, if a woman did inherit something, it wasn't as great as it sounds. Inheritance meant that the woman had to carefully manage her property, often with little help or support, and, more importantly, she had to keep it within the family. If a woman remarried, her new husband could claim her property as his own. Because, of course, everything a woman owned automatically belonged to her husband once they got married. But if a widow couldn't remarry, or worse, if she refused to give up her inherited wealth for some reason, she could be seen as a threat to the established order. Wealthy, powerful women were a danger to the patriarchy because they could hold power, so they could easily become targets of lawsuits, accusations of theft, or even worse, be subjected to imprisonment. They were considered disobedient to the norms of the time. It's not exactly like a modern inheritance case where everyone's fighting over who gets the family fortune. In medieval times, inheritance meant that women were constantly facing legal challenges and often losing against the men who thought they deserved everything a woman had earned or inherited. I mean, at this point, it almost feels like the real crime here was just being born female in the first place. Social crimes. The woman who was too loud. Let's take a breather here and talk about another social crime women faced in medieval times: being too loud. Now, this may sound silly, but in a world where silence and obedience were golden virtues for women, speaking out was not something most women could do without consequences. Women were expected to be silent, gentle, and compliant. If you were a woman and you dared to raise your voice in public, especially if it was in a way that displeased men, you could face some serious punishment. A noisy woman was a problem. A noisy woman could stir up trouble, could gossip, could challenge authority, and could simply just be a nuisance. The crime of talking too much, speaking your mind, or even just being a little bit loud could be grounds for punishment. Now, let's get this straight. We're not talking about someone committing a crime like assault or theft. Oh no. In these cases, women could be punished simply for being too outspoken. In some cases, it was as simple as being put in the stocks. For others, a public flogging might be the punishment of choice. Oh, and don't forget about the ever-popular scold's bridle, a nice little metal device that made sure your mouth stayed shut. In case you were wondering, medieval justice for women was not exactly subtle. We're not done yet. So far, we've just skimmed the surface of what life was like for women in medieval times when it came to crime and punishment. We've talked about dowries, witchcraft, inheritance, divorce, and unfortunate loudness. But believe me, we're far from done. These medieval systems were full of quirky little laws, misunderstandings, and injustices. Let's keep going.
Part 3. The Crime of Adultery, Being Too Pretty, and More Medieval Fun. All right, so let's take a little breath before we dive back in. If you've made it this far, you're either a history enthusiast or you've found a very comfy spot to settle in and just let the medieval madness wash over you. If you're still with me, good. Grab another drink or adjust your blanket because things are about to get even weirder. We've touched on crimes like witchcraft, theft, divorce, and inheritance, but there's still a few real gems of medieval punishment for women left to talk about. So, let's continue our stroll down this strange and dark medieval path. The crime of adultery, or the "how dare you have a fun life" charge. Okay, let's talk about one of the classic medieval crimes, adultery. Now, adultery wasn't exactly exclusive to women during this time, but it did come with a certain set of rules that were a lot harsher for women. Why? Because in medieval society, women were considered property. Remember the dowries? And if a woman had the nerve to step outside the bounds of her marriage, well, that was a scandal of epic proportions. You see, medieval law was obsessed with the idea of female purity. A woman's worth was often directly tied to her sexual fidelity. Men? Not so much. A man could be unfaithful and still be seen as a mighty figure. Women? Not so much. If a woman was caught in the act of adultery, it could lead to some serious consequences. The punishment? Often public flogging, humiliation, and sometimes even execution, depending on how outraged the husband was. And let's not forget about the innocence rule. If a woman wasn't caught, she might have to undergo a trial by ordeal to prove her innocence, because of course the onus of proof was on her. If she had any suspicion of wrongdoing, the public perception would turn on her, and she'd find herself in court with very little hope of being believed. This wasn't a guilty until proven innocent kind of system. It was more like, you're probably guilty, so go ahead and prove us wrong. Because obviously she was the one in the wrong, right? Now, let's take a moment to talk about what happened to the men who were also cheating. If you were a man who was caught in the act, the punishment was often, well, considerably milder. Maybe a fine, maybe a scolding, maybe a stern look, but he wasn't likely to lose his head. But a woman? Oh no, that was a whole different matter. The punishment for women caught in adultery was not only physical, but also social. She would often be shunned, her reputation destroyed, and her life essentially ruined. And all this because she was supposed to be the property of her husband, and her sexual purity was a key part of that. Being too pretty, the crime of attractiveness. Now, if you're thinking, well, maybe some women had a bit of a pass if they were good-looking, I'm afraid you'd be wrong.
In fact, being too attractive could land a woman in hot water during medieval times. Yes, seriously. Why? Well, because, of course, a beautiful woman was seen as a threat. Beautiful women had the potential to distract men, stir up jealousy, and generally cause problems. If you were a good-looking woman in the medieval world, you weren't just a potential marriage prize, you were also a potential social disaster. In fact, women who were considered too pretty often found themselves accused of causing trouble. If a woman was the object of men's desire and things went awry, perhaps the man was married, or perhaps the whole affair was misunderstood, well, that was a problem. In many cases, women like this could be accused of being temptresses, or worse, of using witchcraft to ensnare men. I mean, seriously, imagine being blamed for simply existing as a beautiful woman. That was a common fate for women who dared to have the misfortune of being desirable. So, if a beautiful woman found herself in a problematic situation, let's say a man accused her of causing him to sin, or a husband was jealous, she could be brought to trial. And, well, the outcome wasn't great. The court would often assume that the woman was, at best, an instigator, and at worst, a witch. All of this simply for being too pretty. The crime of being a troublemaker. Now, let's talk about another crime that might not seem like a crime today, but back in medieval times, it was a big one. Being a troublemaker. Now, you might be wondering, what does it mean to be a troublemaker? Well, it wasn't always about doing something majorly wrong. It was more about being a woman who didn't conform to the social norms. For example, a woman who made a fuss about her marriage, whether it was because she wasn't happy or because she wasn't getting what she needed, could easily be labeled a troublemaker. Or a woman who spoke up about the unfairness of things, well, yeah, she might be called a scold and accused of stirring up drama. And the punishment for such troublemaking was fascinating. If you were labeled a troublemaker, your reputation could be tarnished forever. You could end up in a scold's bridle, that delightful piece of medieval torture equipment I mentioned earlier, that essentially locked your mouth shut. And the worst part? It wasn't just a punishment for a day or two. Women could wear this thing for hours, sometimes in public, often as a form of humiliation. If you weren't being quiet enough, you were forced into silence. I mean, what a charming way to handle things. The crime of being a widow. It's complicated. And now let's tackle a fun one, being a widow. Because apparently when you were a widow in medieval times, things could get complicated. You see, when your husband died, you were supposed to mourn, but you were also supposed to stay in line, socially speaking. But sometimes you could end up with a lot of property. A widow, especially one that didn't remarry quickly enough, was a woman with freedom, and oh boy, that wasn't a good look. If you were a wealthy widow, there was always the possibility that your late husband's family or the local nobility would try to reclaim your wealth. A widow could be pressured, even forced, to remarry a family member of her deceased husband in order to keep things in the family. You know, because women couldn't possibly own things for themselves. The crime of being a widow was basically the crime of having independence, and that wasn't a crime anyone in power wanted to see. There's also the very real possibility that, in the eyes of society, you'd be considered a bit suspicious. You were, after all, unattached, and your freedom could be seen as dangerous. A widow's independence was not a desirable trait. It was instead something to be controlled. Let's float over to another royal disaster. We've covered quite a bit of territory in the world of medieval crime and punishment for women. Adultery, inheritance, being a widow, and let's not forget the sheer joy of being a troublemaker. But this journey is far from over, so sit tight. Let's keep floating down this river of medieval absurdities because we're not quite finished yet.
Part 4. The Struggles of Medieval Women, from Infanticide to Public Humiliation. All right, here we are again, another peaceful step down the winding, slightly uncomfortable path of medieval history. If you're still cozy and ready, let's continue our leisurely walk through the bizarre world of medieval crime and punishment for women. I promise we're getting deeper into the nitty-gritty of this world, but don't worry, we'll keep the tone mellow. No surprises, no jump scares, just some gently tragic history. So settle in and let's go a little further. We've already explored crimes like adultery, theft, witchcraft, and the downright punishment of simply being a woman with opinions. But there's a few more delightful social injustices to talk about, ones that will make you thank the heavens we're not living back then. Trust me, by the end of this, you'll have a newfound appreciation for modern law. The crime of infanticide. It's complicated. One crime in the medieval world that was both tragically common and deeply misunderstood was infanticide. And no, we're not talking about something as simple as a mother murdering her child in cold blood. It's far more complicated than that. In medieval society, women didn't always have the same access to resources or support when it came to raising children, especially if they were unmarried or widowed. In fact, giving birth outside of wedlock could have been a major scandal, and single mothers were often viewed with suspicion. Sometimes women would resort to extreme measures if they couldn't care for their children, either because they couldn't provide for them financially or because they were abandoned by the father. In these cases, infanticide wasn't necessarily about malice, but rather the cruel reality of being left with no options. And here's where things get really fun. If a woman was found guilty of infanticide, her punishment could be brutal and public. The crime itself was often treated as a moral and social failing, and the woman involved would face severe consequences, often resulting in public execution. Though sometimes less lethal but still awful punishments were handed out. Women accused of infanticide were rarely given the benefit of the doubt. They were often presumed guilty, with little regard for the difficult circumstances that led to their desperate actions. In a society that offered so little support for women in distress, the punishments often far outweighed the crime. And let's not forget that the men involved, they didn't always face the same consequences. Shocking, I know. The crime of being a beggar, or how poor women got punished. Let's talk about another delightful crime that often affected women in the Middle Ages: begging. Now, begging wasn't just something people did on a corner because they were looking for loose change. It was often a matter of survival. In a time with little to no social safety net, women who found themselves destitute often had few options but to beg for food or shelter. But here's the kicker: being a beggar was often illegal, especially for women. If you were a woman begging in the streets without a husband or male relative to protect you, you were considered a nuisance and a problem. The authorities didn't want to encourage poverty, so they passed laws that targeted beggars. In some cases, these laws specifically targeted women beggars, assuming that any woman without a man to take care of her was automatically a criminal. If you were caught begging without the proper permissions, well, your punishment could be imprisonment, forced labor, or a good old-fashioned whipping. For women, it was especially cruel because once you were labeled a beggar, there were few chances to regain your reputation. This could be a vicious cycle. If you were poor and had no other means of income, you'd be forced into begging, which was against the law, leading to more punishment and humiliation. If you survived all that, you might be able to scrape by, but your place in society was forever stained. And let's not forget how dangerous it could be for women who had to beg on the streets. They were often preyed upon by men, both for their money and their bodies. The crime of public humiliation, a woman's favorite pastime. Let's move on to something a little less tragic and more, well, just plain ridiculous. I'm talking about public humiliation, a favorite punishment for women during the medieval period. Public humiliation wasn't just about punishment. It was about sending a message to society about what women were supposed to do and what they weren't supposed to do. Now, public shaming wasn't a new concept, but in medieval times, it was a highly effective form of social control. Women who were found guilty of minor crimes or social misdeeds, like talking too much, challenging a man's authority, or even just having the wrong opinion, were often subjected to public humiliation.
They might be forced to wear a sign around their neck declaring their crime for all to see. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of being publicly canceled, but with more physical discomfort. Another form of punishment was the pillory. This delightful contraption held the accused woman in place while the townsfolk threw rotten food, mud, and anything else they felt like at her. The idea was simple: shame her. If you were a woman found guilty of gossiping, of fighting with your husband, or even just being too independent, you could end up in the pillory, publicly humiliated for everyone to see. Public humiliation was more than just an inconvenience. It was a method of enforcing compliance with the rigid expectations of medieval society. If you were a woman and you stepped out of line, the whole community could come together to remind you of your place. Charming, right? The crime of having the wrong relationship, because heaven forbid you love someone. Now, let's touch on the subject of relationships, and not just marriages, but the broader idea of women and their relationships in medieval society. If a woman found herself involved in a relationship that didn't fit the proper mold, then she was often punished for her choice. Because clearly the woman wasn't capable of making sound decisions without the input of a man. And if a woman was found to have a lover, perhaps even if it wasn't technically adultery, but a relationship that simply didn't fit societal norms, well, things could get messy. Women could be accused of being promiscuous, immoral, or worse. Even if there was no overt crime, the social stigma of being improper could be devastating. The crime of being a noble woman who was too independent. Now let's circle back to a truly delightful part of medieval society: women with power. Here's a fun fact. If you were a noble woman who dared to be too independent, too influential, or too successful, you were just asking for trouble. After all, medieval power dynamics were constructed around the idea that men were the ones who should be in control, especially when it came to things like land, titles, and military matters. One of the most famous and tragic examples of this is Empress Matilda of England. She was the daughter of King Henry I, and she was supposed to inherit the English throne. However, when her father died, the English nobles weren't so keen on a woman ruling them. Instead, they sided with her cousin, Stephen of Blois. Matilda, being Matilda, wasn't going to let this go. She fought hard, leading armies and besieging castles, but in the end, she never fully achieved her goal. Why? Because she was a woman. And, well, that was just unacceptable for medieval England. For women like Matilda who were born into power or found themselves in positions of authority, the crime wasn't their actions, it was their very existence. A woman in power was a threat, and throughout history, the punishment for this crime was either societal rejection, forced marriage, or even sometimes outright rebellion against their right to rule. Floating over to the last oddity. All right, we're nearly there, folks. I know it's been a long and sometimes deeply strange journey through the history of medieval women, but trust me, there's still more we could unpack about how women were criminalized in the past. But we've covered a lot, and I think it's time to start winding down our exploration. Let's take a quick pause before we wrap up the madness of medieval life for women.
Part 5. The End of the Line. Women in Prison, Execution, and Final Punishments. Okay, folks, we've officially made it to the final leg of our journey through medieval crime and punishment for women. We've covered some pretty bizarre and grim territory, from the crimes of simply existing as a woman, to witch hunts, to being punished for the terrible crime of speaking too much. But now, we're going to look at the final and most devastating punishments that medieval women might face. If you're still here and have somehow survived the horrors of public humiliation, you've got the right mindset for this last stretch. So, let's wrap this up with a look at what happened to women who really crossed the line. Spoiler, it's not pretty. The crime of being a political pawn, or the prisoner who shouldn't have been born a woman. Let's start with the story of women who found themselves caught in political machinations. Now, we know that medieval politics was a little complicated, and women were often seen as pawns in the game. But, much like the crime of being born with power, women who were used as political tools often ended up on the wrong side of history, sometimes quite literally. Take the case of Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen of England. She was only 16 years old when she was thrust into the role of queen in an attempt to keep the throne out of the hands of Catholic Mary I. Jane didn't even really want the crown. But because she was a Protestant and an agreeable pawn in a religious and political struggle, she was placed on the throne. 9 days later, she was deposed by Mary and sentenced to death. The worst part? Lady Jane wasn't even given the option to live quietly in exile. She was executed at the hands of those who saw her as a threat. The real crime here was not what Lady Jane did, but the fact that she was a woman, in a world where women had no real political autonomy, even when they were placed on a throne. She was used and then discarded. In a way, this was the most dangerous crime for medieval women, the crime of being too useful to powerful men. But Jane wasn't alone. Women who were married into powerful families often found themselves imprisoned, divorced, or executed if they were too much of a threat or an obstacle to a man's ambitions. In some cases, a noblewoman might have been accused of witchcraft, or worse, of betraying her husband, only to find herself locked away in a tower or a dungeon for the rest of her life. The crime of execution, not just for the men. Now, let's talk about the big one, execution. Women weren't exactly treated equally in the eyes of medieval executioners. If you were a man, your execution was more likely to be something noble, like a quick decapitation. Women? Not so much. While men were often given the dignity of a swift beheading, women found themselves subject to some of the more brutal, drawn-out forms of capital punishment. Let's take the case of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII. Anne's crime? Well, we're not entirely sure, but historians love to speculate. She was accused of adultery, incest, and treason, none of which were particularly substantiated. But because she was a political pawn in a nasty game of power, and because Henry VIII needed to marry someone else to get a son, she was arrested, tried, and ultimately executed. Instead of the noble beheading, Anne's execution was carried out by a French swordsman. The English executioner, it seemed, wasn't quite up to the job. And that's where the tragedy of Anne's death lies. Not only was she innocent of many of the charges laid against her, but she was also subjected to a far more public and humiliating execution. The scene was meant to serve as a reminder that no woman, no matter how high her status, was exempt from the ruthlessness of men in power. Trial by ordeal, the final and painful way to prove a woman's guilt. And painful is understated. But not all women were executed in a way that history might remember them. Some women were subjected to the trial by ordeal, an ancient system of proving guilt or innocence through physical pain. If a woman was accused of witchcraft, adultery, or some other crime that couldn't be easily proven, she might be thrown into a river with stones tied to her ankles. If she floated, that meant she was guilty, because witches float, and she'd be condemned to die. If she drowned, well, then she was presumed innocent. A real win-win, right? This trial wasn't exclusive to women, of course, but it was particularly common for accused witches. Women, being more vulnerable to accusations due to their supposed moral failings, often found themselves tried in this horrific way. These trials didn't stop until the late medieval period, and their absurdity speaks volumes about the lengths medieval society would go to in order to prove a woman's guilt. If you survived the trial by ordeal, great, you got to keep living, but probably with a reputation as a witch or sinner, which, let's face it, wasn't exactly a step up in social status.
you were still likely to be punished in some other way. If you didn't survive, well, you didn't really lose your reputation, but you didn't really get the chance to care either. The crime of becoming a widow, again. I know we've touched on it before, but the fate of widows was often one of the most tragic and unfair for medieval women. If you were a widow, you were often seen as fair game for powerful men. Widows were frequently pressured to marry again quickly, often to someone who was chosen for them. Their independence was seen as dangerous. Some widows, however, didn't comply, and they found themselves victims of more than just social stigma. Take the case of Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI of England. After her husband's mental collapse, Margaret fought to protect her son's claim to the throne. But when the war ended and Henry was overthrown, Margaret was imprisoned. She didn't have the luxury of being a powerless widow. No, instead she was considered a political threat. Her crime? Protecting her own interests and those of her family. For many women who found themselves widowed, the crime was often not about their own actions, but about how society viewed their status. The widow was often assumed to be a pawn in someone else's game, a vulnerable piece on the chessboard of medieval politics. In some cases, this meant imprisonment, forced remarriage, or, quite frankly, disappearance. Wrapping it up, the crimes of womanhood in the medieval world. As we bring this long, winding tale of medieval women's crimes and punishments to a close, let's just pause for a moment to reflect on what we've learned. The medieval world wasn't kind to women, and their lives were often shaped by cruel, arbitrary laws designed to control them. Whether they were accused of witchcraft, caught in a scandalous marriage, or simply found themselves at odds with the men in charge, the consequences were usually dire. But beyond the legal systems, what really stands out is the fact that medieval society seemed to find it necessary to punish women for simply existing in ways that didn't fit the rigid mold of the time. Women could be punished for being too vocal, too independent, too pretty, or too anything that challenged the accepted norms. From accusations of witchcraft to forced marriages, the medieval justice system wasn't just about punishing crime, it was about enforcing conformity. So, next time you find yourself complaining about something small in modern life, just remember, it could have been a lot worse. You could have been a woman in medieval Europe. And as we've seen tonight, that was no easy road to travel. Thanks for sticking with me through all this. Go ahead and relax now. It's over. Or, well, as over as medieval history ever gets. Good night, folks.
Part 6. The Last Crimes of Medieval Women. Witch hunts, burnings, and eternal misery. Welcome back, or maybe I should say thank you for making it this far. We're in the home stretch now. At least, I think we are. But trust me, there's always a little more medieval weirdness to go around. We've touched on everything from witch trials to trial by ordeal, public shaming to widowhood, and let's not forget good old executions. But don't get too comfortable, because we've got a few more strange corners of this world to look into. You didn't think we were done yet, did you? So, if you've got your blanket, your dim lights, and that cozy sense of I'm in it for the long haul, let's continue. Tonight, we'll dive into the last of the truly grim and, well, tragic ways women found themselves criminalized in the medieval world. This time, we're talking about witch hunts, burnings, and some of the absolute lowest points for women who dared step outside the narrow lines drawn for them by society. Witch hunts, the women who were simply too dangerous to live. Now, we've already touched on the basic idea of witchcraft accusations, but let's dive into the real bloody heart of the witch hunts.
After all, if there's one thing that medieval society knew how to do, it was to turn suspicion into full-blown, life-destroying hysteria. By the 15th century, witchcraft was officially criminalized, and women who were accused of being witches were often subject to horrific fates. But what really made these hunts so terrifying was the sheer arbitrariness of the accusations. Women could be accused of witchcraft for anything. Perhaps they had an unusually good harvest. Suspicious. Maybe they knew a thing or two about herbs and medicine. Definitely suspicious. Or perhaps they were just unpopular with their neighbors. Even more suspicious. At times, all it took was a rumor and boom, you were up for trial. And the rest of your life, and potentially your life, period, was on the line. Let's talk about the infamous Malleus Maleficarium, or The Hammer of Witches, a book published in 1487 that helped lay the groundwork for the widespread witch hunts that followed. Written by two clergymen, it not only suggested that women were particularly susceptible to witchcraft, but also went on to explain in vivid detail the ways in which they should be tortured and executed for their alleged crimes. The authors argued that women, in their weakness, were much more likely to give in to the devil's temptation. Charming, huh? The whole process was terrifyingly medieval. Once accused, the trial was often little more than a formality. The torture methods were designed to extract confessions, because, of course, torture always works to get the truth. Women who were lucky enough to survive the interrogation could be released, but for most, the outcome was grim. A confession meant execution, usually by burning at the stake. After all, what better way to rid the world of such an obvious threat than to incinerate her? It's almost like they went out of their way to make sure this process was as painful and humiliating as possible. The most infamous case is probably Joan of Arc, a woman who wasn't actually guilty of anything resembling witchcraft, but was burned at the stake after being accused of heresy. Joan was a leader, a woman with power and influence in a society that just couldn't handle it. She fought for her country, she dressed as a man, gasp, and of course the authorities went after her for that, leading to her trial, conviction, and ultimately her death. Talk about a classic example of a woman stepping outside the boundaries and paying for it with her life. And speaking of burning at the stake, let's just pause here for a moment and really sit with the horror of it. Being burned alive was a horrifyingly common fate for women accused of witchcraft, heresy, or adultery. It's one thing to be punished for a crime, but this was something beyond most medieval punishments. The act of burning wasn't just a method of execution, it was a public spectacle. Imagine the message it sent. You weren't just executed for a crime, you were humiliated, consumed by flames, and left to burn in front of an audience. You were a warning. And burning was the ultimate form of torture because it didn't kill instantly. Oh no, it took time. The victim often died from shock or asphyxiation, but the physical agony was undeniable. Women who were accused of witchcraft or heresy were more often than not burned in public. This wasn't just about delivering justice, it was about punishing and humiliating. The community gathered around to watch. The act of execution became entertainment. You might even say that the medieval world delighted in the fiery deaths of these women because it affirmed their role as other, as outcasts, as reminders that there were very clear and painful consequences for stepping out of line. The crime of being a woman in power. Now, let's take a slight detour here because there's something very important to talk about. Many of the women who were accused of witchcraft weren't just accused of supernatural acts. No, often they were also women who were seen as too powerful or too influential. They were seen as a threat to the patriarchal order. One of the most famous cases is Elizabeth Bathory, who, according to the legend, was a noblewoman who became one of history's most notorious female figures. accused of killing over 600 young women. Why? Some say it was because of her obsession with beauty and youth, but the most likely reason she was targeted was because she had so much influence and control over her lands. She was wealthy, powerful, and independent, and that couldn't be allowed in a time when women were expected to be subservient to men. The trial against her was as much about political convenience as it was about her alleged crimes. Many historians believe she was framed by her enemies, using her as a scapegoat for the broader political struggles of the time. But regardless of the facts, her name became synonymous with the terrifying idea of women who were so threatening in their autonomy that the only way to bring them down was to accuse them of the most heinous acts imaginable. After all, she was a woman, and that made her dangerous. And so the rumors and accusations started, and the trial was a messy, terrifying affair that would haunt her name forever. Now, before we go, let's end on a softer note. Well, as soft as medieval punishments can get. In addition to witchcraft, many women were accused of being healers, especially in rural areas where the medical knowledge of local women was essential for helping families. Women, after all, were often the ones who passed down knowledge of herbs, remedies, and medical practices, especially in times when the church forbade the study of proper medicine by non-clerics. But if you were a woman who knew too much about herbs and potions, you could quickly find yourself branded a witch. If you cured the common cold, gave birth to a child without help from the clergy, or helped your neighbors in any way, you might be suspected of witchcraft. You were a dangerous woman. You knew too much. It didn't help that most of the medical knowledge women had was based on folk traditions, things that the male-dominated church saw as unworthy, heretical, and ultimately dangerous. Some women who were too skilled in medicine were hunted down, put on trial, and executed, not for poisoning people, but for simply knowing how to cure them. The end of the line, the last crimes of medieval women. So, as we wrap up, we come back to the question of what these women did wrong. What crime did they really commit? It wasn't being witches. It wasn't about being dangerous. It was simply about being women in a world that was obsessed with keeping women in check. Whether you were accused of witchcraft, burned at the stake, or buried in a political conspiracy, the underlying truth was the same. Medieval women, no matter how powerful, clever, or independent, were doomed to be viewed through a lens of suspicion. And that's the real crime here, the fact that their society was so deeply suspicious of any woman who stepped outside the boundaries. Their punishment wasn't just death, imprisonment, or torture, it was being erased from the pages of history, reduced to nothing but the charges laid against them. So, with that, we close the book on the grim, tragic, and bizarre world of medieval crime and punishment for women. It was a time when your life was often decided by the whims of powerful men, by societal expectations, and by your gender. At least today we have a little more control over our lives, even if the justice system is still not perfect. Thank you for sticking through all of this. Go ahead and unwind now, knowing that the worst medieval punishment is probably just going to be a bad cup of coffee tomorrow. Good night, everyone.